All right, let's dive into a world, well, a world most people probably haven't given much thought to: wholesale merchants and live animals.
Yeah, not your typical office job.
Not even close. Forget those hectic auction scenes you see in movies.
Right.
We're going deeper, looking at what these merchants actually do. Our listeners sent in a super detailed career guide, and we've got insights from RoleCatcher, that platform, the one that uses AI for like navigating the whole job market.
Fascinating stuff.
Totally. So we're talking skills, pros and cons, even how tech is changing the game in this whole industry.
It's a blend of like the traditional way of doing things meeting head on with cutting edge technology.
For real. Okay, so let's break this down. The guide says their main thing is connecting buyers and suppliers, working out those deals, making sure everything runs smoothly. Sounds pretty basic on the surface, but I'm guessing it's more than that.
Oh, absolutely. This isn't just about, individual deals. It's about understanding supply and demand on a global scale. These merchants are key players. You know what I mean? They're a link in the chain that affects everything, like everything from how much we pay for meat
Hmm.
to, and get this, even conservation efforts.
Wow. See, I never would have thought of that.
Yeah. And another thing that surprised me, the guide really emphasized that this isn't just a job for people who, just love animals. Of course, you have to understand the business side, but it's also about connecting with breeders, farmers, even zoologists, people who are really passionate about what they do.
So the human element's really important, even when you're dealing with, well, live animals. Which, speaking of, the guy did mention some ethical stuff. Seems like this field could lead to some tough calls, right?
There are definitely some big questions there. We'll get into those a bit later, but for now, let's focus on the skills needed. What struck me was how some go beyond, just being good at business.
Right. Like active listening, crucial for any negotiation, but especially when things get emotional. And then there's social perceptiveness, that skill of like reading between the lines, picking up on what's not being said.
Huge, especially these days when everyone's bombarded with information. Being able to actually listen, pick up on those subtle cues, that builds trust. And trust is key for any negotiation, let alone one involving live animals.
It's also like being a detective, figuring out people's motivations so you can make a deal that works for everyone.
I like that. And speaking of skills, RoleCatcher, the folks behind this guide, they're really onto something with this emphasis on those soft skills. They've even got these AI tools that can analyze a job description and then help you make sure those skills are highlighted on your CV.
Wow.
Yeah, it's using technology to emphasize those like uniquely human aspects that algorithms sometimes struggle with.
That's wild. Okay, we've talked about what they do and what you need, but
Yeah.
let's be real. What's the payoff? Pros and cons, what are we looking at?
Right. Well, the guide doesn't sugarcoat it. You've got the potential to earn a good living, which is always nice, but it often comes with long hours and not always on a regular schedule. That international travel perk might not seem so glamorous when you're dealing with a shipment of, I don't know, exotic birds at 3 in the morning.
Yeah, that whole jet-setting image just got a lot less appealing. Speaking of those deals, what kind of money are we actually talking about here?
That's where specialization comes into play. The guide says someone working with, say, prize-winning show dogs, it's probably on a different pay scale than someone specializing in, livestock for agriculture. Finding your niche, it's just like any other field, really.
Right. And we can't forget the physical demands. It's one thing to negotiate a deal for, I don't know, a truckload of sheep, but coordinating the transport of, like, a rare reptile, whole different story.
Definitely stamina, resilience, being able to think on your feet, those are all key in this line of work.
I bet there are some stories there.
Mm.
Picture this. You're wrapping up a deal involving, okay, how about this?
Yeah.
A whole herd of bison. Talk about an icebreaker at a party.
Just the logistics
All
involved.
right.
It really makes you realize how much we take for granted.
Right.
The journeys these animals go on, the people making it all happen, and more, the technology working behind the scenes. Speaking of technology, did you know RoleCatcher also has AI-powered interview prep?
No way. Really?
Yeah. They have this tool that goes through job postings and CVs to, like, predict what questions they might ask you in an interview. But get this. They even give you AI-powered feedback on your practice answers.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's like having a personal coach right there on your phone. And it all ties back to what we were saying about those soft skills. These tools help you present them in a way that really stands out.
It's crazy. It feels like we're not just talking about the future of, like, job hunting, but the future of this entire industry.
You got it. And that's where things get really interesting. We've talked about the people, the ethics, but tech is changing the whole game when it comes to trading live animals. Online auctions are already huge, and real-time market data, that's becoming more and more important in negotiations.
It's a whole new world.
It really is.
Which makes you wonder, how will technology impact the ethics and logistics of this whole thing down the line?
Hmm.
I mean, will we see things like AI-powered systems that monitor animal welfare during transport, or blockchain to track where exotic animals come from to stop illegal trading?
Now, those are some interesting questions. It just shows how everything is connected, the choices these merchants make, the technology they use it, creates ripples. Definitely something to think about, especially for anyone considering this career path.
It's a lot to process, and honestly, we're just scratching the surface. But before we go any further, let's talk about the sheer variety in this line of work. Live animals covers a surprisingly wide range of creatures, don't you think?
It really does, and the guide we have here actually does a good job of explaining all the different specializations within this field.
Yeah, like, did you know there are merchants who specialize in insects? We're talking butterflies for exhibits, crickets for people who breed reptiles, even those rare beetles that collectors go nuts for.
It's a global market, and that's where a deep understanding of how it all works is crucial. It's not just about knowing your animals, but navigating the regulations surrounding their trade, which can get complicated
I
fast.
bet. Every country probably has its own rules.
Exactly. But that's another area where tech is playing a bigger role. Imagine software that keeps merchants updated on the latest import and export rules, or even flags potential issues before a deal is finalized.
Like having a built-in compliance officer.
Precisely. This lets the merchants focus on what they do best, building relationships, negotiating those win-win scenarios, and making sure the animals are transported safely and humanely.
Which brings us back to the ethical considerations we touched on earlier. I'm curious, how does the guide say these merchants should navigate those gray areas? Because let's face it, sometimes profit and ethics might be at odds.
You're right, and the guide doesn't shy away from that. It talks about potential conflicts of interest, the pressure to make a sale even if things aren't perfect, and how important it is to walk away from a deal that might compromise animal welfare.
Sounds like it really makes you examine your morals just as much as your business sense.
Absolutely, and it underscores the responsibility these merchants have. They're not just moving products, they're advocating for living creatures. That requires a certain kind of empathy and a commitment to doing what's right, even when it's tough.
It's a high standard, but important, especially in a field that's often under scrutiny.
For sure. Transparency and accountability are key, and I think that's what consumers are demanding more and more these days. We want to know where products, including the animals we interact with, come from. Whether it's a pet, a farm animal, or even an animal going to a zoo or sanctuary.
And hopefully that consumer pressure, combined with all the technological advancements we've been talking about, will lead to even better standards in the future.
It's something to be hopeful for. It all comes back to the fact that this industry is always changing. The wholesale merchant of tomorrow will need to adapt, be tech-savvy, and deeply understand the ethical implications of their work.
It makes you wonder what kind of person thrives in that environment. We discussed the skills, but what about personality? Is this for someone who loves adventure? You're a master negotiator, a logistics whiz? What does the guide say about that?
Well, there are some interesting insights there. Remember those career stage profiles we mentioned? They offer some clues.
Okay, yeah. So the entry-level profile, it describes someone as motivated and detail-oriented with a strong passion for the live animal industry. Sounds pretty typical, right?
Sure, but it emphasizes that genuine interest is essential. Then, as we move up to the junior merchant level, the focus shifts to results-driven, experience in conducting market research, and skilled in negotiating trade agreements.
Sounds like someone who loves the thrill of closing a deal.
Exactly. And as they become a full-fledged wholesale merchant, the guide calls them dynamic and results-oriented with a proven track record.
Oh, and they highlight strong communication skills and the ability to work with different types of people, which makes sense since they're connecting all these different parties.
It's a delicate balance. And notice how the senior wholesale merchant profile focuses on experience and leadership. They're developing strategic plans, building partnerships, and leading teams.
They're not just focused on individual deals anymore. They're shaping the entire operation.
Exactly. The guide even mentions that having a master's in business administration, specifically focused on international trade, is common at this level. It shows just how complex and high stakes it can be.
Wow, so this isn't just a one-size-fits-all job. It's a career path with room to grow and specialize. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. It is. It just goes to show there are paths for people with different skills and interests within this world. Whether you're passionate about a specific animal, love the thrill of the deal, or enjoy logistical challenges, there might be a place for you here.
That's a good point.
Hmm.
Okay, we've covered what these merchants do, the skills, the pros and cons, the ethical side, even how technology is changing things. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's your biggest takeaway from all of this? What really stuck with you?
That's a great question. For me, it's a good reminder that even in our increasingly digital world, it's still all about human connection.
I like that. And it's something RoleCatcher seems to understand, with their focus on helping candidates highlight those human skills.
Exactly. But you know what else this whole deep dive has got me thinking about? Something we haven't even touched on yet. This whole deep dive has got me thinking about the animals themselves, you know?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, we've talked about the people, the business side, the technology, but not so much about the live part of live animal trade.
Exactly. What if we changed our perspective a bit? Instead of how do we make this work for everyone involved, it's how do we make sure things are the best they can be for these animals?
That's a different way of looking at it, like
Yeah.
putting their well-being first in every decision.
Right. Imagine like a future where these merchants, they're held to even higher standards when it comes to animal welfare, where their expertise isn't just knowing the market, but really understanding what each species needs.
So it's not just about getting them from point A to point B, it's about making that trip as stress-free as possible. We're talking specialized transport, maybe even using those AI-powered systems to keep track of their vital signs the whole way.
Exactly. And what about the role of sanctuaries and conservation efforts?
Hmm.
Could these merchants actually become like key players in finding homes for animals that have been displaced, maybe because of habitat loss or the illegal pet trade? Could they help with breeding programs for endangered species?
It's like their job could shift from just making deals to actively creating a better, more sustainable future for these animals.
Right. What if success in this field wasn't just measured by, profits and deals, but by the positive impact on the animals themselves?
That's a powerful thought. It reminds us that even in places you might not expect, there's a chance to make a real difference. But shifting gears a bit here, you mentioned earlier that the guide goes into detail about the different career stages in this field.
It does. And those profiles, they actually tell us something about the kind of person who might do well in this line of work.
Let's hear it. Okay, so the entry-level position, it mentions someone motivated and detail-oriented with a strong passion for the live animal industry. Seems pretty standard.
Sure, but it highlights that a real, genuine interest is important. Then we move up to a junior merchant, and the focus changes to results-driven, experience in conducting market research, and skilled in negotiating trade agreements.
Someone who enjoys the challenge of closing a deal thrives in that fast-paced world.
Exactly. And then as they progress, becoming a full-fledged wholesale merchant, the guide describes them as dynamic and results-oriented, someone with a proven track record.
And they emphasize being a good communicator and being able to work with all sorts of people, which makes sense, right? They're the link between so many different parties.
It's a balancing act, for sure. And then we get to the senior wholesale merchant level. Notice how experience and leadership really come into play. They're developing strategic plans, building partnerships, and leading teams.
So it's bigger than just individual deals now. They're shaping the whole operation. The guide even mentions that having a master's in business administration, with a focus on international trade, that's pretty common at that level.
It really highlights how complex and high stakes it can be. This isn't a field you just fall into. It takes dedication, education, years of experience.
Yeah, it sounds like a path with a lot of potential, not just a one-size-fits-all kind of role.
Exactly. It just goes to show there are so many different ways to be a part of this world, each needing its own skills and personality type.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about what these merchants do, the skills, the pros and cons, the ethical considerations, even how technology is changing things. But before we wrap things up completely, I'm curious, what's one thing you'll take away from this deep dive? So much to consider, right? This career path is way more, well, nuanced is the word, I guess, than I ever would have thought.
It really is. One of the things that struck me is how much potential there is to make things even better for the animals.
Yeah.
We talked about how tech can make transport safer, more comfortable, and that idea of merchants actually advocating for those animals, pushing for more humane practices, that's exciting.
Definitely. It's like this whole field, it's at the crossroads of like globalization, tech, our relationship with nature, all of it.
It really makes you think, even in those industries we don't always see, there are people making decisions that affect us all.
It's a good reminder to stay curious, right? Don't just accept things at face value. And never underestimate what people can do when they put their minds to it, especially when it's about making the world a little bit better, even for, a bison being moved to a new home.
Well said. Who knew we'd have so much to say about wholesale merchants and live animals?
Right. It just shows. Every deep dive, there's always something new to discover.
Absolutely. I can't wait to see what we uncover next time.
Me too. But for now, we'll leave our listeners with all of this to ponder. This has been, wow, eye-opening, thought-provoking, and honestly kind of heartwarming. Until next time, stay curious, everyone. There's always more out there to learn.
And always more connections to make.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.